Hmm. Well, welcome back, everybody. How long has it been? It's been since middle of May, almost 4 months, huh? Well, from this perspective, you all look good, those of you who have come back. Some people are new, I think, to the group. This is a meditation and sutra study class. In the meditation part, I usually do something at the beginning of each semester, but I've done it so many times and now they recorded it. And so rather than run the risk of just repeating myself or saying what some of you already know, if you're interested in the basics of sitting meditation, which is what the talks were about, and I spent 3 consecutive talks talking about what to do with the body, because there's a very specific way of doing the sitting meditation technique physically, and then there is some very precise ways to go about the breathing, which is extremely important, and to bring the body and the breathing into harmony. And then the third element is the mental or the inner work, which is most important. And when these 3 are working in conjunction, simultaneously, and according to this training method, you're on your way, you're all set. Then it's just a question of perseverance and patience with it. So those of you who already know the technique of doing the sitting meditation, you don't need to go to that video, or what is it?
Yeah, it's on the playlist. YouTube playlist.
Whatever that means, it's on a playlist. Yeah, I guess you could say it's play. It is like play. So it's on a playlist, and you can go play with it. But I would say to you again, I want to emphasize that everything that's on there is something that I'm just handing down from my teachers. It's not like I'm teaching meditation. Rather, I'm just conveying what I was taught. So in that sense, you can have some trust in this, that you're tying into the traditional training meditation techniques of sitting that have been handed down from teacher to student for many, many generations. But that being said, please, if you are new to it, look at all of it. Take all of it in. Don't simply go, what should I do with my mind, and go to the last part, or just focus on the breathing, or just the sitting. But see them as 3 interrelated wheels that, when moving, bring about these transformations. And this is nothing more than a kind of a stopping and listening to yourself, a stopping and contemplating. Sometimes it's called quieting the mind, but I think that's a little deceptive, because it's actually not stilling the mind so much as bringing it into a different realm of awareness. It's a heightened use of the mind, paradoxically brought about by the stilling of its normal activities. So some people think it's just a spacing out, stilling of thought, a kind of tranquil remove, and it's not really that at all. If done properly, what it does is expand awareness and consciousness. It attunes it. It reorganizes it back to what's called its original ground, or its original function. And that function, when activated, is meant to know and to see everything as it truly is. So it's a really activated state of consciousness rather than a remove. So that is important to understand what meditation is about. This whole text goes through what it is and what it isn't. So we won't do any meditation instruction tonight. We're into the last chapter, believe it or not, and I'm not going to make any predictions about when we're going to finish this last chapter, nor even bother to count the pages. We'll just sort of take it as it comes. For some of you, I don't go fast enough, and for some of you, I go too fast, and I never heard anybody say it's just right, so I'll leave that out on what side you're on. If I go too fast, I apologize, and you can contemplate it during the week. If I go too slow, you can enter samadhi and just ignore what I'm saying, and do your own internal lecture on this material. Whatever makes you happy. By the way, being happy is really what Friday night's all about. So I want to stress that again. We set aside an hour and a half every Friday night to sit in this, call it a sacred space, or the space apart from all the dust. And that in itself, even if there was no lecture, and even if the lecture is bad, which it is most of the time, the very fact that you can pull out once a week for an hour and a half, unplug the phones and all the devices, and just sit quietly with people that are not bothering you, hitting on you, at least till the lecture's over, and not in your space trying to sell you something or buy anything from you, or anything like that, it's a really rare thing to have, and it's becoming more and more rare and an endangered phenomenon in this world. So for no other reason, you simply come on a Friday night, not to do anything but to do nothing. It's wonderful. It truly is. Now at the beginning you're going to think, why is doing nothing wonderful? But once you get a flavor of this, it's like an exquisite dessert. Because everything else that we're involved in is a bunch of doing and a gathering, like a vacuum cleaner. We're just sucking up things 24/7. And to turn the vacuum cleaner off, I'm going to use another metaphor. This is not from the sutras because they didn't have vacuum cleaners. But they talked about sweeping clean. So to turn the vacuum cleaner off and just unplug for the 45 minutes we sit, and then to just hear the words of these really ancient texts that I think have probably the most profound insights and purchase on the human mind and how we tie ourselves up, how we untie ourselves, and how we reach our full potential as human beings. That's what these texts are about. To do that an hour and a half once a week is probably the best thing you could do for yourself. And don't feel selfish in doing it, because whatever you get in that hour and a half, even if you don't generate any income or any new plans or any relationships or any deals or anything else, you've made the world a better place. Honestly, just an hour and a half of doing nothing, the world sorely needs right now, because it's on fire with so much hyperactivity and development and exploitation and expropriation of everything. We're just drilling it, scraping it off, and now looking to other planets to do the same. So if for an hour and a half you just pull away and do nothing, wow, the earth itself will thank you. Okay. And if you are living with people, if you disappear for an hour and a half, believe it or not, they kind of like that. I'm sorry, it's like, oh, he or she's gone. Oh, well, really, this is the value of what is not. I'm quoting a text. There's a famous passage from one of the texts that says, everybody knows the value of what is, and they're constantly getting it. But the cultivated person, knows the value of what is not. And that makes the difference right there. So, tonight is a appreciation of what is not. Okay, so let me begin what is not going to be a good lecture. We're on the chapter 103, page 103, final instructions. Now the reason I'm not making any predictions about how fast, this chapter is really pithy. He's got, on one hand, it's a summation of all he's taught. On the other hand, he's taking it to a new level. And at the emotional level, and I think this is the understory of this last chapter, he is parting with his disciples. He has been a father, a mother, a brother, a teacher, in a sense, to these disciples. They have formed really strong and deep relationships with him. And now they probably never really thought that this would end. And it's going to end, because all things that come together come apart. And this is not the case for sages as well. So there was a time, Hui Neng says, when I came into this world, there's a time I was here, there's a time that I'm ailing and getting sick, and then he says in this chapter, there's a time that I will now leave you and I'll be gone. And so they have to then start to deal with this. And in some ways, having been through some kinds of relationships like this is as powerful, and I would say in some ways more powerful than the best of human relationships between sisters and brothers and mothers and fathers and husbands and wives and so forth. This relationship that they have here goes beyond all of that. Now, it does go into that because by providing the monastery, he gave them food and clothing and shelter. So in a material way, he has, in fact, supported and sustained them. But in a deeper way, in what sort of comes before all of that and what follows even the ending of one's life, he has been giving something that is priceless and invaluable, which is teachings in the Dharma. And they know that. And they have all been really deeply transformed. These are very different people than when they first met him. And it's this transformation, this change of consciousness that all cultivators of the way are after, they seek. They know that they're unaware. They know that there's a certain amount of ignorance and habituation that holds them. But the releasing of that doesn't simply come from the study of the arts and the sciences. It can be helped by that. But that has to do with the understanding of one's own mind and nature. And there's very few, I would say, physicians, mental physicians that can go into that space and untie and liberate and provide the medicine. And Hui Neng, for them, is one of them. He's not for everybody, but for these disciples. And so they are extremely appreciative and in some ways attached to him because they haven't quite gotten a complete sense that this is something that they can do now on their own. And so this last chapter is both kind of pushing them away to get out of the nest and at the same time saying, but don't feel I'm abandoning you. I'm not cutting off our relationship. So it's a very tense moment. So the text begins, and I'll read it. You can go into, one day the master summoned his disciples, Fa Hai, Zhi Cheng, Fa Da, Shan Hui, Zhi Chang, Zhi Dong, Zhi Che, Zhi Dao, Fa Jian, and Fa Ru, and said to them, how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 10, right? 10 disciples. And he said to them, you are different from the others. After I pass away, you should each go and become a master in a different region. I will now teach you how to explain the Dharma without departing from its original source. So the master, first of all, calls them together. This is not unusual. In the living tradition, the student-teacher relationship, there's a time of initial encounter, which is really kind of dramatic and hellish at moments. And in other words, why are you here? And your answer isn't immediately accepted, and there's a knock on the head and a pushing back and forth. I'm using metaphors here, but sometimes it's literal. And then there's this period of training or incubation, which is smelting, and it's hard because you're being put into a furnace of transformation of all your bad habits and character flaws into something that is, and they use the word, pure gold. Now, that is not easy. I once compared it to going into a sauna where the door gets locked and you don't have your hand on the thermostat. And so you're just sitting there, and then sometimes that heat goes really up, and it's to detoxify, so to speak. This is what a teacher does, and then cold water is applied just skillfully at the nick of time, and then the heat goes up again. And you submit to this training because there's trust. And the trust is reinforced or tested every day. Am I changing? Am I becoming a better person? Is my mind becoming more unencumbered? And even though there may be dark periods in this, it's often the case that these precede the light. And so there has to be moments where there's this necessary sort of uncomfortable darkness, because the nature of the habituation is almost unconscious. It's so strongly formed that we would not get at it ourselves without this pressure, nudging, and rubbing and heat. And so these 10 have been through the kiln. They've been through the sauna, so to speak. And now he says, you're different from the others. Meaning, what does this mean, you're different from the others? Why does he start with that? Because obviously there's quite a few people there, but these 10 have been singled out. Now they're singled out at the end, but they've also been sort of singled out from the onset and ongoing. They have received, it's not that they were special in the sense that he favored them. This isn't what it's about. The only reason that they are being singled out is because they have become quick receptacles of Dharma, quick receivers of that. And it's not like they're special because he likes them more than others, or they gave him more offerings and he's partial to them because he really likes stinky tofu, and Faru gave him a lot of that, and so he's saying, I should. No. They're there because they made the grade. They made the cut. This is the, if you use athletic terms, this is the team. And it's not because they're favored, it's because of their merit. It's very different, which reminds me of the thing Mark Twain said. Mark Twain liked to say things about heaven and God and things. So once he said something, when someone goes to heaven and they bring their dog along, it's a little difficult because one enters heaven by favor. In other words, blessings, grace, and whatnot, not by merit. And so but he said, if it were entered by merit and not by favor, then God would say the dog could come in and you stay outside. Just a side. I like Mark Twain. In any event, this is not favor, this is merit. They're different from the others. How are they different from the others? Anybody want to try? I'm not meaning to put you on the spot, but maybe you had some ideas of why they're different. Now, again, it's not that they're weird, different. Okay, but why is he saying you're different? Why is he telling them that? What could be on his mind in telling them that? Pressure? Praise? What is it? Anybody? A little louder.
That they can be a master, that they can go and teach.
So it could be that he's...
They're not students anymore.
Yeah, he could say that you're different. I mean, this is sort of graduation. This is the matriculation exercise. It could be that, right?
Maybe they themselves don't need a teacher so much. They can stick to a path with seriousness without being knocked off of it.
Because he's calling together as he's starting to leave. So the implication would be is like, I'm going to give it a last shot. You guys have really been at the bottom of the class all along, and now I'm calling you together because you're really different, and I'm just hoping in the last few breaths I have, I can pass something on that you'll remember. The other ones are gone, the ones that got it. No, it doesn't seem to be that way. Anybody else? Yes?
Maybe it's kind of he's moving on, so he's trying to kind of pass off his Dharma successors in some ways, like his teaching. His successors are his teaching.
Right. But why is he saying you're different? That's my point.
Maybe they've thrown off their afflictions.
The question would be, how are they different? And they have to say how they're different. Now, as you get there, there's like, say, hundreds. So maybe some of them are thinking, why were we called? Why were only 10 of us called? And this is usually not done in a very public way. This student-teacher transfer is usually a very private thing. One, because it can provoke jealousy and envy among those who aren't in the select group to come. So often this is done at an odd hour of the day or night in a private setting, and it's not announced. It's not like you look on the Dharma bulletin board and say, you're on the A team and that you've been cut. And so it could be that he's trying to keep the profile a bit low here, but he's also reconfirming in them that you've been called because you're not the same as everybody else. You too have been selected, and it's probably also in their minds they're wondering, maybe, and this is possible, that they didn't see themselves as different. Maybe they weren't aware until this moment that in fact they had reached that stage where they were ready to be teachers. And so he's actually making them more conscious of their difference. And it follows here, after I pass away, you should each go and become a master in a different region. So yes, he's confirming the way you're different is you're ready to become masters. Which, by the way, takes the fun out of being selected. It's not like he's saying, you guys can retire now, you've made the grade, and we're going to send you off to southern China on the beaches, and you can invent surfing and stuff. He's actually saying to them, you can become a master. Now, if they're different and they're smart, they're going, oh. Oh, that is not. Remember him early on when Hui Neng was told that he was a teacher? His life was in danger. He had to flee assassins. He had to live among hunters for a number of years. And then his teacher says the Dharma arises from difficulty. This is not easy. So being a teacher, wow. So I think the initial thing is, I'm excited, I'm here, I'm different, I'm going to be a teacher. And then simultaneously, if they're pretty sharp, it also dawns on them, this is going to be somewhat of a duty, burden, or responsibility. He says, go to a different region. I will now teach you how to explain the Dharma without departing from its original source. So this whole line is, he's imparting to them, he's going to impart to them how to actually be teachers, how to be masters. And this interesting line here, how to teach the Dharma without departing from its original source. What's the original source? A particular sutra? Anybody remember this from the earlier parts, what the original source is? What original source he's talking about? Meaning him? He's the original source?
The Bodhi mind.
The mind of all Buddhas is what he's talking. The original source is not particularly something that's in a text, nor is it in a country or a region, nor is it with a certain group of people. He just says it's the understanding and opening, expanding of the mind in all its states. The original source is just the true mind. And so he's saying in this sense, I'm going to teach you to teach Dharma directly to the mind ground, not by some text per se, not by some formula, not by a catechism approach. I'm going to give you the mind-activating principles by which you can open the hearts and minds of those that you teach. So he's not going to teach them, teach this text, or say these things. He's going to actually give them a catalytic tool that can actually transform. This matches, by the way, I was just, Siddhartha Gautama, when he was the teacher called Shakyamuni Buddha, at the time when he was passing on, and this is right from the Nikayas, he has this wonderful line. He said to the bhikshus that he had gathered, and I'm quoting, "Go forth for the good of the many, for the happiness of the many, out of compassion for the world, for the welfare, the good, and the happiness of gods and people. Let no two of you go in the same direction. Teach the Dharma, which is beautiful in the beginning, beautiful in the middle, and beautiful in the end. Proclaim both the letter and the spirit of the holy life, completely fulfilled and perfectly pure." This is the Buddha expressing to his disciples many centuries prior to Hui Neng, but following the same formula. And why does he say no two go in the same direction?
Spread out.
Spread out. I think that's probably the spread out. And also, stand on your own 2 feet. Stand on your own 2 feet. I mean, and I think what he's saying, he's saying, go to a different region, each of you. So he's saying, look, you have leaned on me, and I have taught you. Now don't lean on each other. Don't feel as if you can't stand on your own. Who did I lean on? I went to the Fifth Patriarch, but once the Fifth Patriarch certified me, I went on my own. I can remember my teacher saying to Hung Sure and I, he put us together. Well, we kind of put ourselves together, but then he kind of kept us together. And it wasn't all honeymoon. I just, but then I've never met anybody where it has been. Maybe you have, that's absolutely honeymoon heaven perfect to be with somebody else. For the most time, I find it difficult just to be with myself. That's some people. But he said, I put you together because if you put two birds that don't get along in the same cage, they learn to get along. And then he said, but on the other hand, Buddhas don't come in pairs. They come one by one. So there's a message here that, and it's a very profound message, that although you might have teachers, you might have Dharma friends, ultimately, you have to liberate yourself. There's no other way to do it. And the teacher at best can just show the way. So in a sense here, he's reaffirming this. Do not lean on anybody else at this point. It's interesting too, it's not exactly like he's telling them to be missionaries, but he is saying to spread the teaching. So what's the difference? What's the difference between, saying go out and be missionaries and convert those in each direction to the Dharma, to Buddhism, as opposed to saying what he said? And I read you the quote before, out of compassion for the world, for the welfare, the good, and happiness is the intentional motivation, not for conversion. In fact, generally, Buddhist teachers who travel around don't really call themselves missionaries. I've never really heard that phrase used, probably because it has a necessary connotation with a particular form of aggressive proselytizing. And I think with probably few exceptions, Buddhism has never gone with invading armies or colonial occupiers to spread its teaching. It's usually spread by teachers who, but their very embodiment, their aura of goodness and whatnot attracts listeners. Also, technically, you can't speak the Dharma unless requested, so even if you go, you really can't set up a soapbox someplace and start proclaiming Dharma because it's not been requested. So there's a number of restrictions that make it not so much a missionary edict that he's saying, but out of welfare, out of compassion, go and share. It's almost like a, I would say, Doctors Without Borders kind of idea. Go and take your medical training to where people are hurting and suffering. And I think part of that would be, and also don't do it for lucre. Don't do it for fame, don't do it for power, don't do it for money. Just do it because it's a good thing to do. So that's why the Vinaya protects them, should protect the monks and nuns who go out, because they're supposed to have very few possessions and keep wandering and not do it for money.
And with, what I was curious about was, what about the teachers that are already in the regions where these masters...
Yeah, everybody hear the question, what about the teachers that are already in the regions? I would challenge them to a Dharma duel. And those that can manifest spiritual penetrations win. How high can you levitate? Oh, you're the guy. I'm half joking, but this is what happens.
Yeah.
You're raising an interesting question. So let's assume that at this time, they're going to be going to regions where it's pretty much new, unfamiliar. But as that becomes the case, now we're talking about China, there's very few regions that haven't been touched by Buddhism at the time of the Tang Dynasty. So you're raising a very good question. And often the reception in the new area, as the reception to Hui Neng occurred, was competition and rivalry and fighting. And so I'm guessing that he's probably, through his own example, already showing them how to camouflage their egos in a sense where they can go and not ruffle. Will they avoid it all the time? Probably not. And you can see the history of China I guess, history of Japan, wherever Buddhism has gone, as it established itself, this kind of infighting necessarily follows. So it's something that Buddhism hasn't been able to avoid, even though theoretically there would be no ground for that kind of fighting. Remember earlier he says, contention is not the way. Those who contend don't get the way. And he says, if you contend, you're not in my dharma, and so forth. Nonetheless, that goes.
And yet you are different.
And so I think what he's saying to them, you are different, and therefore I expect you to behave differently as well. I can remember, I told you this story before, when I was first cultivating, I was going out to protect Dharma Master Hui on his bowing pilgrimage. And because I had some martial arts training and whatnot, I thought the best way I could protect him was using my martial arts. And so, and to augment my martial arts, I put an axe in the backpack to go on this bowing pilgrimage together. And then just as you're going out the door, the master said, okay, good, have a good pilgrimage, and then give me the axe. And I don't know how he knew I had the axe. I had just done it secret. It was my secret. And I said, you know, what axe? He said, the axe. I said, that's for chopping wood. I said, okay, but if I give him, you know, the axe, I have no way to protect Heng Shui. And then he said, if you fight with anybody at all, you are not my disciple. I will not consider you my disciple. I will not take you back. He said, even if you explode in anger, I won't take you as my. You cannot have a single thought of anger, much less an act of violence against any living being, including ants. And that was how it went out the door. So I went from my martial arts and axe to total vulnerability. But the thing here was, you're not my disciple if you do that. So I think with Hui Neng, it's very similar. He's saying, you know how I am. I don't contend, I don't fight, and I expect you to do the same. And often, he avoids this by being careful where he goes. Like he himself didn't go to the imperial palace, remember when he was requested? That's a good way to stay out of the crosshairs. Now, if you've been following the news, you realize that Washington, D.C., and what goes on is often not away from the crosshairs. If you want to get involved with that kind of conflict and tension, you can go into those scenes where there's fighting for power and privilege and prestige. But where he's going is not those places. So my guess is they're going to monasteries that have been abandoned and neglected. Hui Neng did this, Han Shan did this, Shu Yun did this. If you read their autobiographies, their last 20 or 30 years of their life are wandering to remote places that have been neglected and repairing them. Old monasteries, building them up again, getting established, bringing in monks and nuns, training them in a different way, away from the capital, away from the hot spots, away from Rome, so to speak. And because they do that, they often stay under the radar, and they're able to do what they can do without triggering that, even though it's the subcurrent that's there. It's almost like another example is called the sound of one hand clapping. And, you know, which sounds, a Zen koan, what's the sound of one hand clapping? Because, you know, so there's no sound. But the way my teacher explained it, he said, if you put up your hand and there's a hand like this, it makes the clapping sound. There's a boom, explosion. If you are unmoving and sort of just low profile, there's no hand up and it goes right through. So he said the meaning of that is don't seek out situations where you're fighting and contending with others. And so I think probably what's going on here, they already know how to do this. I remember in Tiananmen was what, 88, 89? 89. So in 89, the end of 89, after Tiananmen, they had an ordination ceremony in Shanghai, the first since 1949, and 4 American monks, one of myself at the time, went over to carry out that ordination in Shanghai. And then afterwards, the ordination, we got to travel around. We wanted to travel around and go to all the holy places. And they were very nervous about letting us go because this was after, only 20 some years after the Cultural Revolution, and most of the places that we wanted to see had been liberated. from superstition. In other words, burned to the ground, destroyed by the Red Guard during the Cultural Revolution. And so on one hand, they wanted us to travel and to see these places and pay our respects. On the other hand, they hadn't got them back in shape yet. So often the places we went to, you just put your hand on the wall and the paint was still wet. And you put your hand on the Buddha image and gold would come off on your hand. It was like overnight they were painting and putting these things up. But they also very much controlled where we went. And so when we knew from some text or whatnot that this little pathway led to a remote area, they would say, no, you can't go there. You shouldn't go there. Why is that? They didn't say because we've made a mess of it. They'd say, oh, there's tigers and they'll eat you. And there's bandits and they'll rob you. And, oh, well, we're not afraid of that. Oh, well, no, they got really nervous. So what we did was they sent a official guard person from the religious bureau to accompany us. And so there was 4 of us and they only had 1. So we'd split into 2 groups and then he wouldn't know who to follow. So when he followed the 2 that went that way, the 2 of us would go off another way. And in that way we got to explore these back regions. And one of the things I remember in 2 mountainous areas, because we got away and we went deep in, we got away from the official monasteries and temples, and all of a sudden we start to encounter cultivators in the woods and in the remote places. And this was the real thing. You can just take a look and you go, whoa. They didn't have on the fancy red robes and the golden jade beads. They were growing stuff in their own gardens. Their little clothes that they had were hanging in line, men and women both. And we would wander in, and I remember this nun. This was in the remote mountains of Jiuhuashan, 9 Flowers Mountain. She was way back there. And we wandered in, and she looked outside the door, and it was almost like a deer. She was just and then she put her palms together and smiled, and she said, I have nothing to offer you except these little beans. Please have something to eat. She says, very unusual to see people back here, especially strangers like you, Westerners. And then she said, but I knew you were coming. And this happened more than once. And then we'd sit down, and I tell you, it was just like bathing in some fresh pool. Not much conversation, just maybe having a little thing to eat or something, bowing it on our way. But afterwards, you go like, what was that? That was a very different person. This also happened in another remote area where we went with some monks, and it was the same thing. And then they told us that the way they survive and the way they prosper is to move far away from the capital and towns as they can, so they can continue to cultivate, because the authorities aren't interested in them because they're not influencing people. They said, so the good part of that is we can cultivate according to the teachings. The bad part is we've lost our line of teachers. So from the time of 1949 on, we've been trying to do this every generation without teachers, and now, so they were very interested in talking to us because they knew we had a teacher who was originally from China, and they were very interested in learning about the student-teacher thing. What does your teacher teach you? Because we've lost contact with that. But they survived by staying out of the competitive pressures of where the Dharma or the Buddhism was being successfully, how shall I say, restored. I don't know how else to put it without getting into trouble. So, anyhow, I digressed.
What do you think happened to his own monastery? Because he sent his, whatever, I don't know if there was talks to his...
Nanhua Si.
So who takes over his role after he passes away?
It's gone through a number of changes and transformations. It goes down and then comes up again. I don't know what the situation is now. I think there's an attempt to keep it going.
No, I don't know this guy. He sent 10 students away.
What happens to their place? They have nothing. Their place is just a lean-to.
There's the other few hundred students.
Then by word of mouth, or in this case, and I'm just saying this for your consideration, through dreams and other communications, cultivators find their way there. This happened more than a few times. where we would be introduced to somebody who just said, in one case, I saw you bowing on the highway. Well, that monk had never been to the United States, so how did he see us bowing on the highway? Those kinds of things. So there's a level where this goes on, where on the external surface of things, there's fighting, there's competition, the Dharma thrives and the Dharma declines. But at a deeper level, below the concrete that's poured over something, things germinate and they stay alive and they come back. So it's just really interesting to watch, and I'm guessing that this is still going on in China today and in other countries. So it's got a transmission of its own that seems to go below the surface. And I'm guessing that these 10 are in tune with that, and they're going to be going where there are potentials that will respond to this in the proper way, where they're not fighting for name or fame or to establish themselves. Yeah, very, very good. So, oh my, any other questions? I mean, we got 3 minutes here. See? No, it's not my fault. We're not ripping through this chapter. Okay, let's go ahead. First, you should bring up the teaching of the 3 classifications of dharmas, then the 36 complementary pairs. Answer any with its opposite. This avoids setting up in either side. And then he goes on, in explaining all these teachings, never depart from the essential nature. So now you have a corresponding line, not departing from the original source, not departing from the essential nature. This is to say they're one and the same. The essential nature is the original source. The original source is the essential nature, which makes this totally timeless. It's not an original source that goes back to some primordial golden past. It is right here and now, always available. The original source is right within each of us as we're sitting here. In our own essential nature is the source of all the dharmas and all the teachings and all the Buddhas. This is really powerful stuff. What he's saying is not historically contingent. Okay? It's not coming over a period of time. It is always ever available in one's own essential nature. That's the source. And so we're saying, where do all Buddhas come from? They come from this place. Okay. If someone should suddenly ask about something, answer with its opposite, thus neutralizing the pair. Always find the opposite principle. For example, coming and going are relative to each other. Ultimately, the two cancel each other out, and then there is no place to set up. Any questions on that? These next couple of sections are pretty...
It's interesting, there's so much teaching about the falseness of dualities, but this is actually using the illusion of dualities perhaps as a tool to reveal again that the dualities are nothing. Clearly,
he's working through dualities. But he's also bringing up a very interesting principle that appears in a lot of text. And one of the best expressions of it for me is not a Buddhist text per se, it's the Zhuangzi. And in the Zhuangzi, you have a chapter basically called Relativities. And it's very interesting because Zhuangzi is making the same point, that because of our egos and our attachment to our place and our person, that we reify into something that is solid and true and the ultimate determiner of things, we then get into attached views of what the nature of reality is, not seeing that it's completely relative. And so he does these wonderful things where he takes animals and compares what they see. Like he takes called the pung bird, the great golden-winged pung bird, which is a humongous bird. And the pung bird says, I just flew over the Sierras, brushed my wings against the Rockies, and now I'm landing on the ocean here to have a little lunch. And then he said, and the little bobolink comes out of the brushes and says, you're totally hallucinating, you're drunk. There's no such thing as mountains with snow. I've never seen anything what you call snow before. And there's no flying over miles and things like this. I go from this bush to that bush, and that's it, that's the world. And so Zhuangzi is playing and saying, from their position relatively, their realities are such. And so this idea that he's playing with here, in a similar way, he's saying, we set up on one side or the other and think we have a grasp and a purchase on this, when in fact we're just seeing it from a frame of reference. And our frames of reference we take to be so solid and real are nothing but constructions, like just putting on little glasses and saying that's how it is. But we can maybe see this in others, you know, but we don't necessarily see it in ourselves. And so being able to see it in oneself is what he's going to be teaching. He's going to say, I'm going to wherever you set up in your absolute, I'm going to reposition it to a relative and thereby break your attachment to that. That's why you have this line here at the end. And then there is no place to set up. He's not so much, this is not teaching him how to be a clever rhetorical debater, to win a debate or to sort of confuse people to think, oh my gosh, he must be just, you know, crazy wisdom because everything I say he turns, and wow, he's, what do they call that? In literature they call this the joker or the jester. There's another word they use for the playful upsetter.
The obnoxious one?
Yeah, no, every house has. That's not what he's doing here. He's doing it for a therapeutic person, which is not allowing a place to set up, because it's in the setting up that they obstruct their original nature. They obstruct the free flowing of their unimpeded wisdom. And so remember, his line is, let the mind be unattached, clinging to nothing. That was his awakening. And now he's saying, but the mind that wants to attach is extremely powerful and extremely habitual. So it's going to have 100 different ways it sets up. And he's giving you the principle, whichever way it sets up, and almost always it's going to be setting up, the way you unlock it is to present its opposite. And then you neutralize its position. Let me give you just one example, and we'll close. Can somebody cite the page where, remember when I think it's Flying Cat John comes back, and he asks about impermanence and permanence? I don't have my regular book with me, which is marked up, so... anybody remember that? This is a good one. That's it. Thank you. The trickster. So he's not training tricksters. He's not saying, I'm going to train you to be tricksters and go out and pull the rug on everybody, just to see them fall, just to see them tumble, and you then stand up because nobody can pull your rug. So there's a postmodern trickster. He's not even doing that. Thank you. So if you look at 94 and 95, you'll see a perfect example of this. So this monk tried to assassinate him. Before he was a monk, he told him to go off and hide. He went off and he studied, and he came back, and he said, you gave me, and now I'm back, and I've studied the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, but I don't understand the meanings of, middle of page 94, permanence and impermanence. Will you can explain them for me? So the master should say, permanence is the Buddha nature, which is ever eternally dwelling and not changing and abiding, and impermanence is just your discriminating mind. That's what he's expecting. Now, even with the Dharma, not to say, coming and going, he does, not the trickster thing, he does the uncoupling. And he says, impermanence is just the Buddha nature. And permanence is just your discriminating mind. Now, at this point, Xinjiang is completely fluxing. What? And he says, thank you. You've awakened me. And he leaves. No, he says, your explanation contradicts the sutras. I mean, whoa. And the master said, I translate the genuine teaching. How can you say I contradict the sutras? But he says, the sutras say that the Buddha nature is permanent, and you say it's impermanent, and good and bad dharmas, even the aspiration to Bodhi, are impermanent, and you say they're permanent. These contradictions have made me more confused. And his confusion is that he has not realized that he is set up and attached to a particular position or view. And so the master then explains it for him, and he says, da-da-da, and then let's see where the very personal line is. Next page, 96. Then Jerchung suddenly gets it. It's not about getting or not getting truth. It's about letting go of your mind that wants to grasp and attach to things, even to Dharma. And it's that letting go that opens up the mind of wisdom. And then Jerchung has this verse. For those who clung to impermanence, the Buddha taught permanence. And of course, the converse is true. Those that clung to permanence, he taught impermanence. Neither of them is, quote, the truth. They're just dualities. So there's an example of him and his own teaching, and my guess is most of these have been taught along those lines themselves, so they're probably understanding in their own transformations how they got uncoupled from their particular attachment. However, now we can read this, but if you try this, well, I'm laughing because I can remember reading the first time, oh, that's easy. Somebody says X, you say Y. They say up, you say down. That doesn't, it's not quite that simple. It's not quite that simple because you have to understand the nature of that attachment and not simply answer with its opposite. You know what I mean? It's like saying, I saw this thing where doctors take scalpels and they do surgery. And then you take a scalpel and you say, like to your, I would do it with my little sister, now lie down, and then they cut you. Then what? I don't know. You know, what comes next? Do you know how to go in and actually, no, I didn't get that. I just know how to cut. I just know how to present the opposite. So this can easily turn into bantering, what they call koto-chan, head mouth zen, chanting. So to do this skillfully has to provoke in the person both a kind of initial confusion and then a letting go and a liberation, and often accompanied by joy and tears. So it's not just a rhetorical device where you kind of do one-upsmanship. And so knowing what point to address in that person is not necessarily obvious. And it's going to differ. So I'm just saying there's a great deal of skill involved. The next part we'll go into next week. Basically, it takes apart from a Buddhist point of view what the nature of reality is and what you're dealing with in how the mind constructs and where. So he's actually giving them almost like their final seminar in profound medical training in the Dharma about how to go in and do analysis, diagnostics, and then prescriptions and so forth. So I will stop there for tonight. Any questions? Hope not. Okay, announcements?
So first I want to announce that our new semester just have been started. So today is the first Sixth Patriarch class, and we have also last Wednesday we had the Stephen Taylor class. He's teaching about nature of the mind, so you can check it out. Tomorrow, Reverend Hank Sher will give the lecture about Avatamsaka Sutra, 7:30 p.m. And I want to also remind about our meditation twice a day in the morning from 6:15 to 7:15 and afternoon from 5:15 to 6:15 every day.
How far is Bart? 3 blocks.
6 minutes,
Yeah,
or
so
8 minutes.
you can come in at 6:15.
6:15 in the morning. We open it at actually 6, so
and
we
at
can sit 1 hour
head
and
off to
15
Bart.
minutes.
I'm just making this, if you're on Bart and commuting, and it would make a difference. Or if you don't do that, and then the day completely burns you out, then when you come back, get off of Bart and walk here and do 5:15 to 6:15 and recharge. So at either end, if you want to do both, wow, wherever you commute to will be a Pure Land. But if you only do one on each end, it'll save your life.
And one more, tomorrow is also a special event in Oakland, and this year we have 125th anniversary of visit Vivekananda for Parliament of World Religion in Chicago, what's happened in 1893. And tomorrow the Vedanta Society in Berkeley organized a special event because actually he traveled also to Bay Area, and he gave the 2 lectures in the First Unitarian Church in Oakland, 685 14th Street. So tomorrow from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. will be special event. It will be Rev Heng Shu who will give the lecture. We have will be president of Graduate Theological Union. Is you know him? Anyway, we have 3 Swamis and one also representative of Sufism as well. So it will be very interesting event. So everyone is welcome. So if you want to hear more information, please come and I pass you more information.
You all know Vivekananda? You ever hear of Swami Vivekananda? Kind of interesting. Anyhow, he came to, along with a number of delegates, the first time that representatives of Eastern religions who were actually living the traditions came to the United States in 1893 and had a parliament called the Parliament for World Religions. They had the World's Fair there. That was the first time the Ferris wheel was introduced, and they had the sideshows, you know, what's it called? You walk down the arcade. Huh? Louder. No. Well, they had all the nations of the world lined up in a progressive order. So the darkest people were at the bottom, and they would have little displays. They'd be out there in their huts and doing dances and whatnot. Then you went to Eastern Europe and so forth, and finally you went to Europe, and then finally the top was the United States. And so you had an evolutionary view of humankind starting from the dark. This is 1893, and this was supported by anthropologists at the University of Chicago. You know, okay, so that's how it was. That was the thing you walked through, and by the time you got to the end, you were really glad to be a white American. You're like, we're the best. And so then they had all the industrial technical stuff, the tractors and the new stuff out. But they said, of minds, not machines. And that gave rise to the Parliament of Religions. They wanted to bring all the religions of the world together for a show. And so somebody said, well, why don't we invite the other, which was Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Confucianism, and so forth. They sent out invitations, and so people responded. Vivekananda responded from India and came. Of course, with the invitation didn't come any of the perks you usually get when you go to conferences, like your hotel and whatnot. So he slept in a railroad car down to the meatpacking part of Chicago for 2 nights before the conference opened because he had no money, no place to stay. And then others came, and the press went wild. They were so used to the Catholics and Presbyterians with their grays and blacks and blah, blah, blah. And also because Darwinianism had come in at that time, they didn't have an answer for evolution, so there was a lot of, and all of a sudden these guys and women get off these trains with these brightly colored orange and yellow robes and everything. And so the press just flocked to them. And they were very, very popular. They gave addresses. This gave, shortly after that, D.C. Suzuki, who was 19 years old at the time, came over. And because one of the people at the parliament says, let's start a reverse missionary movement. And so instead of sending Christian missionaries to the east, let's invite the Eastern to come and missionize in the west. And so he and his father-in-law subsidized the reverse missionary movement, brought Vivekananda back, Dharmapala, Arnakarika Dharmapala, and D.T. Suzuki and so forth. So at the turn of the century, Chicago was like the Berkeley of today, and there was all these teachers and sages teaching, and then they went off to different parts of America. And basically this thrived until World War I, and that put the kibosh on all the dreams that people have of an international brotherhood, sisterhood of religions. But for a few years there was a very vibrant period. So Vivekananda was one of those. They were really good at English. Dharmapala himself had memorized most of the Old and New Testament because he was taught by missionaries over there, but he was a Buddhist. So he could quote, line and verse of the Bible. His first speech was a complete disaster because he went up into Chicago. You know Chicago at the time was the meatpacking industry of the world, right? So he went up and he said, you cannot be a Buddhist. You cannot even be a good Christian. You cannot be a good person if you eat the flesh of animals. And there was this like total stunned silence in the room. And he's like, did I say something wrong? And so he kind of learned how to coach himself a little better and got better as he went on. But it really had a powerful impact, and that actually began the coming of Buddhism into the West for the first time, not through books or missionaries or scholars, but from these teachers. Vivekananda did a lot in the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area. So
Actually, his talk in Chicago you can find it in YouTube.
oh yeah,
It is there.
yeah. And this continues. The Parliament continues. And when there were a couple of religious groups, I'm not going to mention names, who were not so happy that so much excitement went to covering this. And so they kind of put the kibosh on having that in the future, or at least extending invitations to everybody. So the invitations only went out to those who were getting into heaven directly, and then the others were not included. But then in 1993, they did it again, 100 years anniversary in Chicago again, and the Dalai Lama and others participated in that, and they've been having them every 2 or 3 years since in different.
There's one this year in November in Toronto.
Okay, so the one coming up in this tradition is in Toronto in this year?
November 1st to 7th.
Unfortunately, most Americans will not be able to go there. I'm sorry. I'm sure things will settle down then and we'll be able to get visas to go to Toronto.
They should be voting then.
Right. And there's been different ones. South Africa had one. Who's gone to them in the past year? Who? Sandy? Anybody else?
We were in the Salt Lake City. the
Salt
last
Lake
one.
City had one. South Africa? Any others?
Australia, I think, was Melbourne.
Australia, Melbourne? Yeah. So
Barcelona.
you can go to these. They're really quite interesting. Well, I think we'll put together a delegation, right, to go to Toronto this year? Next year?
The girls' schools program got accepted, so they're going.
Okay,
They'll be presenting.
okay. If nothing else, for the wonderful food. No, I'm serious. They got all kinds of food and a lot of good vegetarian food that takes place. Houston Smith was instrumental in trying to get the indigenous American Indian world Indian population as part of the religions on this forum. And so since then, they've included that. They didn't in the original 1893. That wasn't considered to be a valid religious, but now there's representatives from that. So, and they do all kinds of stuff from deep spirituality to engaged political activity along with religious inspired lines and so forth. So, good way to spend November, but you should vote, right? Yes.
Absentee.
Absentee. Get it on paper.
You can mail them in.
I don't know why it would be important to vote because everything seems to be going really well, but I won't do that tonight, I promise. Okay, so that's it? Any other announcements? Okay, we'll do the transference. Good to be back. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise.
Bowing respect to the triple Jew.
Everybody knows. See, they're all sitting here, so we better do those last 3 vows.